Close your eyes and picture a pirate island. You see rum. You see Jack Sparrow stumbling through a tavern. You see cinematic chaos wrapped in sea salt and adventure. Hollywood spent 50 years building that image for you, and every single frame of it is a comfortable lie. The real Tortuga did not smell like adventure. It smelled like charred meat, sun-baked blood, and the particular desperation of men who had been thrown away by the world. Men who had decided, in the absence of any other option, to throw the world back. This tiny, turtle-shaped island, barely 25 miles long, 5 miles wide, sitting off the northwest coast of Hispaniola, was not a movie set. It was a laboratory. A brutal, violent, rum-soaked laboratory where the most dangerous question of the 17th century was being tested in real time. Can human beings, stripped of kings, stripped of priests, stripped of every inherited authority, build something that actually works? The answer the buccaneers of Tortuga gave was yes. Badly, violently, with staggering human cost, but yes. And that answer reached on a rock in the Caribbean 50 years before the Enlightenment put it into philosophy and 100 years before the American Revolution put it into constitutions, is why this island matters. Not because of the treasure, because of the idea. This is the complete, unfiltered, unromantic story of Tortuga. From the hunters who became pirates to the governors who became criminals to the treaties that killed the dream. This is the rise and fall of the world's most dangerous island, and why its ghost still haunts every story we tell about freedom. Before we go any further, smash that subscribe button and drop a comment below. If you were alive in 1650, would you have sailed for Tortuga or stayed safe under the crown? I read every single one. Let's get into it. To understand why Tortuga existed, you have to understand what it was born to resist. And what it was born to resist was the most arrogant claim in recorded history. In 1494, 2 years after Columbus sailed west, the Pope divided the entire non-Christian world in half. The Treaty of Tordesillas handed one side to Spain and the other to Portugal. Every island, every coastline, every human being already living there, none of them were consulted. The Pope drew a line on a map, and that was the law of God. Spain took the Caribbean seriously, brutally seriously. They established colonies on Hispaniola, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. They enslaved the Taino people until there were almost none left. They forced enslaved Africans into the sugar fields, the silver mines, the machinery of colonial profit. They built forts. They stationed warships. They created the most profitable extractive economy the Atlantic world had ever seen. And they protected it the way men protect things that make them rich, with overwhelming violence. By 1600, Spain was shipping gold, silver, tobacco, and sugar back to Europe by the ton. The Caribbean was not a collection of islands. It was a factory with walls made of warships and laws made at the point of a sword. England, France, and the Netherlands watched all of this and felt the emotion that has driven more history than any other. Envy. They wanted in. The problem was that Spain had the Pope's blessing, an enormous navy, and absolutely no interest in sharing. Anyone else who showed up in the Caribbean was technically an intruder. In practice, anyone else who showed up was a target. So what kind of men showed up anyway? Not noblemen, not soldiers with careers to protect. The men who sailed into Spanish-controlled waters in the early 1600s were the people Europe had already discarded, escaped indentured servants who had survived contracts designed to kill them, sailors who had deserted from English and Dutch navies where flogging was policy and death was routine, Protestant refugees from France, Huguenots fleeing Catholic persecution, men with criminal records, men with debts, men with nothing left in the old world who had decided to try their luck in the new one. These were not the founders of anything. Not yet. They were just running, but where they ran to would change everything. They ran to the western coast of Hispaniola. They ran to the wild country the Spanish had colonized but couldn't fully control. And there, in the jungle, doing something completely unglamorous, they became the seed of the most famous pirate civilization in history. They became hunters. Here is a fact that the Pirates of the Caribbean films will never show you. The men who became the buccaneers of Tortuga started out as barbecue chefs. Not metaphorically, literally. When the Spanish colonized Hispaniola, they brought cattle and pigs with them. As the indigenous population was wiped out and the Spanish attention shifted to more profitable islands, those animals went feral. By the early 1600s, Hispaniola's western coast was full of wild cattle and wild pigs and almost nothing else. The French drifters who settled there figured out quickly that hunting these animals was survivable. They developed a technique. They smoked the meat over wooden frames called balcons, using green wood to keep the fire slow and the smoke thick, preserving the meat in the Caribbean heat. In French, the man who tends a balcon is a buccaneer. In English, buccaneer. These men were not romantic. They wore rough clothes stiffened with the blood and fat of the animals they hunted. They lived in the wild. They traded smoked meat and hides to passing ships. They had no political ambitions. They were just trying to eat. The Spanish noticed them eventually, and the Spanish responded the way Spanish colonial authority always responded to anything it did not control, with soldiers. They sent troops to the western coast of Hispaniola. They burned the buccaneer settlements. They slaughtered the wild cattle that the hunters depended on for survival, not because the cattle were valuable, but because eliminating the cattle would eliminate the hunters. It was a policy of deliberate starvation, and it almost worked. The French survivors were driven from the coast. They fled across a narrow channel to a small island just offshore, an island shaped, from above, like a turtle. The Spanish called it La Tortuga. The French called it Tortuga. And there, with the Spanish fleet visible on the horizon and nowhere left to run, the hunters started making a different calculation. If the Spanish were going to hunt them, they were going to hunt back. The buccaneers knew the Caribbean. They knew its currents, its storms, its hidden coves. What they needed were ships, and the Caribbean, conveniently, was full of Spanish ships loaded with everything Spain had extracted from the Americas. The transformation from hunter to pirate was not a moral crisis. It was an adaptation. You killed what you had to kill to survive. They had just changed what they were hunting. Tortuga itself made this possible. Look at it on a map, and you understand immediately why it became what it became. 25 miles long, 5 miles wide. The northern coast was all cliffs, vertical rock face dropping straight into the ocean, impossible to land troops on. The southern coast had a single natural harbor, deep enough for large vessels, sheltered from the Atlantic weather. The jungle covering the island's peaks gave fresh water, food, and cover. And its location, sitting directly at the mouth of the Windward Passage, the main shipping lane between the Atlantic and the Caribbean, meant that nearly every Spanish treasure fleet sailing back to Europe passed within sight of it. Columbus had passed it without stopping. Spanish colonizers had ignored it because Hispaniola next door was already producing wealth. For over a century, Tortuga had been no one's priority. The buccaneers recognized what everyone else had overlooked. It was the perfect base of operations, and they started building. Here is the moment where the story gets genuinely surprising. Take a group of escaped servants, criminal fugitives, religious refugees, naval deserters, and men whose origins no one bothered to ask about. Put them on an island with no government, no law, no authority of any kind. What do you expect? Pure chaos, every man for himself, violence without structure, a Hobbesian nightmare, the state of nature, red in tooth and claw. That is not what happened on Tortuga. What happened on Tortuga was something far stranger and, depending on how you look at it, far more interesting. The men who arrived on that island built a society, not a comfortable one, not a clean one, not one you or I would want to live in, but a functioning one with rules, with economics, with institutions, all of it invented from scratch by people who had every reason to distrust every institution they had ever encountered. The first and most important principle of Tortuga was radical by the standards of the 17th century. It did not matter who you were before you arrived. Your nationality was irrelevant. French, English, Dutch, African, the island absorbed all comers. Your past was irrelevant. What you had done in Europe stayed in Europe. Your class was irrelevant. There was no aristocracy on Tortuga because there was nothing for aristocracy to rest on. No land titles, no inherited offices, no family names that carried weight. You were what you did on the island and nothing else. A crude economy emerged. Smoked meat was traded for ship supplies. Ship supplies were traded for weapons. Weapons bought protection. And weaving through all of it, lubricating every transaction, was rum, cheap, plentiful, and absolutely central to everything that happened on that island for the next 50 years. The Spanish, who had driven the buccaneers to Tortuga in the first place, were not content to leave them there. In 1629, they launched a serious assault, soldiers, warships, the full apparatus of colonial power. They succeeded. They drove out the English and French settlers, executed the ones they caught, and occupied the island with a garrison. For a brief moment, it looked like the experiment was over before it had properly begun. But the thing about people who have nowhere else to go is that they come back. By 1630, English settlers from St. Kitts had returned to Tortuga and re-established themselves. The Spanish attacked again in 1635. They were driven off. In 1638, a French Huguenot engineer named Jean Levasseur arrived with a commission from France and a set of ideas that would transform the island from a hiding spot into a fortress. Levasseur was not a pirate. He was a builder. He looked at the rocky promontory above the harbor, a natural defensive position that everyone had used for cover, but no one had properly fortified, and he built a fort. Not a wooden stockade. A real fort, cut from the cliff stone itself, with walls thick enough to absorb cannon fire and artillery positioned to cover every approach from the sea. He named it La Montagne, the mountain, and from its parapets he could look down on any ship entering the harbor. Then Levasseur declared himself governor. France had not exactly appointed him. He simply announced that he was in charge, and the buccaneers, who had just watched this man build them an impenetrable fortress in the middle of Spanish territory, decided that probably deserved some respect. Under Levasseur, Tortuga became something more than a refuge. It became an economy. Pirates who used the harbor paid a percentage of their plunder to the fort. In return, they got safety, supplies, and a market for their stolen goods. Merchants from across the Atlantic came to buy Spanish silver, church plate, and trade goods at a fraction of their original price. The island became a black market the size of an entire colonial port, and it was the most profitable place in the Caribbean that Spain didn't officially control. Levasseur lasted 12 years. He was stabbed to death in 1652 by two of his own lieutenants over a dispute he had refused to resolve. This was very much in keeping with the spirit of the island. But the system he had built outlasted him, and under the man who came next, it reached its absolute peak. We're about to get into the Golden Age, the era of Henry Morgan, Francois L'Alaniz, and the most audacious raids in Caribbean history. But real quick, if this kind of deep, unfiltered history is your thing, make sure you're subscribed. We go to the places other history channels skip. Hit subscribe, ring the bell, and drop a comment if you could have sailed with any of the pirates we've mentioned so far. Who would it be? All right, back to the blood. Before we meet the men who made Tortuga famous, we need to understand the system they operated inside. Because the most remarkable thing about the Brethren of the Coast, the loose confederation of pirates and privateers who used Tortuga as their base, was not how violent they were. It was how organized. Before any voyage, the captain and crew of a Tortuga pirate ship sat down and signed what they called articles. These were legally binding contracts in their own legal system, which was the only legal system they recognized. The articles specified everything: the captain's authority and its limits, the share of plunder each crew member would receive, the compensation schedule for injuries. Lose your right hand, you receive a certain number of pieces of 8. Lose your left hand, slightly fewer. Lose an eye, a different amount still. Become entirely disabled in service of the crew, the highest compensation of all. Think about what that means for a moment. In 1650, a sailor in the Royal Navy had no contract, no compensation for injury, no guaranteed share of anything. If the captain decided to flog him or hang him, that was the captain's prerogative. The sailors of Tortuga, by contrast, had a written compensation system for workplace injuries that many modern professions still don't have. It gets more radical. The captain of a Tortuga pirate ship was elected by the crew, not appointed by a colonial power, not inherited through family, elected, and he could be removed also by vote if the crew decided his leadership was inadequate. The quartermaster, who controlled the distribution of plunder, was also elected and answered to the crew, not to the captain. This separation of powers, executive authority in the captain, financial authority in the quartermaster, was specifically designed to prevent any one person from taking everything. Historian Marcus Rediker, who has written more carefully on this subject than almost anyone, calls these pirate ships some of the most democratic institutions operating anywhere in the Atlantic world in the 17th century. He is not being provocative. He is being accurate. The English Parliament was still fighting over who had the right to vote. The French court was an absolute monarchy, and on a pirate ship off Tortuga, the crew was voting on who commanded them. There was also the institution of matelotage, a formal partnership, legally recognized within the Tortuga community between two men. It granted shared property rights, mutual obligations of care, and inheritance rights if one partner died. The institution was real. It was documented. And in a world where rank and birth determined almost every right a person had, here was a small island where men were creating their own recognized partnerships from scratch. None of this makes the buccaneers good. They robbed. They killed. They terrorized the shipping lanes and coastal towns of the Caribbean with a systematic brutality that left real human wreckage behind them. The same men who voted on their articles and split their shares equally were also enslaving captives and destroying communities. There is no clean version of this history, and anyone who hands you one is lying. But the tension between internal democracy and external brutality, between the egalitarian code and the violent practice, is exactly what makes Tortuga so worth understanding. These men were not idealists. They were pragmatists. The code existed not because they were virtuous, but because it worked. It kept crews together. It prevented the captain from running away with everything. It gave men a reason to fight hard because they knew their share was guaranteed. It was a ruthlessly practical system, and it was, by the standards of its era, genuinely revolutionary. Now we get to the men who made Tortuga a name that still carries weight 3.5 centuries later. Three figures above all others. One who became a legend in a single night, one who became a monster, and one who became something more complicated than either. Pierre Legrand, a Frenchman. His story sounds invented, and it probably wasn't. In the late 1640s, Legrand was at sea with a crew of 28 men in a small boat, barely more than a coastal vessel, running desperately low on supplies. They had been out for weeks and found nothing worth attacking. Then they spotted a ship on the horizon, not a small merchant vessel, a Spanish galleon, part of the treasure fleet. A warship carrying over 300 men, bristling with cannon, one of the most heavily armed vessels on the Atlantic. The rational calculation was simple. There was no way 28 starving men in a small boat could take a Spanish galleon. Pierre Legrand attacked it anyway. He ordered holes bored in the bottom of his own boat, ensuring there was no retreat, no surrender, no option other than victory or death. Then in the dark, his crew climbed the sides of the galleon, overwhelmed the watch, and found the captain playing cards in his cabin. They captured the ship entire. Legrand sailed it back to France, collected his fortune, and by most accounts never returned to piracy. He had made one bet, with his life as the stake, won, and had the wisdom to walk away. He became a legend on Tortuga not for a long career, but for proving once completely, What was possible if you were willing to go all in? François L'Alanaise was the opposite of Legrand in almost every way. Where Legrand was a single brilliant stroke, L'Alanaise was a sustained campaign of terror. A Frenchman who had come to the Caribbean as an indentured servant, his years of servitude had left him with a hatred of the Spanish that was not strategic but personal, the kind of hatred that has no off switch. He was not content with ships. He raided coastal towns. He tortured prisoners. Alexander Exquemelin, the ship's surgeon who sailed with the buccaneers and later wrote the definitive account of their world, described acts of cruelty by L'Alanaise that became legend for their extremity, in a community not known for squeamishness. L'Alanaise sacked Venezuela. He looted the city of Maracaibo. He led raids that brought back staggering plunder to Tortuga. And then in the late 1660s, his luck ran out. His ship wrecked on the coast of Central America. His crew scattered. According to Exquemelin, L'Alanaise was captured in the Darien and met an end that matched the violence he had spent his life delivering. Some accounts claim he was eaten. The source is unreliable, but the symbolism is almost too perfect to ignore. Henry Morgan is the man who stands above all of them. And the most important thing to understand about Henry Morgan is that calling him a pirate misses the point. Morgan was Welsh. He came to the Caribbean as a young man, served in various capacities, and by the 1660s was affiliated with the buccaneers of Tortuga and operating under letters of marque, documents issued by the English governor of Jamaica, authorizing him to attack Spanish ships and settlements. This distinction mattered legally. It did not matter at all in practice, because what Morgan did with those letters was beyond anything anyone had attempted before. In 1668, Morgan sacked Portobelo, the fortified port on the coast of Panama where silver from the mines of Peru was assembled before being shipped to Spain. Portobelo was not a soft target. It had some of the heaviest fortifications in the Spanish Caribbean. It had multiple forts, hundreds of soldiers and artillery designed to annihilate any naval assault. Morgan took it anyway. The plunder was enormous. The Spanish governor of Panama wrote to the English governor demanding to know how Morgan had done it. Morgan sent him back a pistol and the message that he hoped to come to Panama someday to teach him how to use it. This was not bravado. It was prophecy. In 1671, Henry Morgan did something no privateer had attempted at scale. He gathered nearly 1,500 men, the largest pirate army ever assembled in the Caribbean, and marched them across the Isthmus of Panama. Through swamp, through jungle, through 3 weeks of exhaustion and starvation and Spanish ambushes. He attacked Panama City from the landward side, the direction no one expected, because no one had ever believed anyone would try it. Panama City was among the richest cities in the Western Hemisphere. Morgan burned it to the ground. The treasure he extracted was almost incalculable. The aftermath tells you everything about the era's dark comedy. England and Spain were technically at peace when Morgan launched the raid. He knew this. He did it anyway. Spain demanded his arrest. England, embarrassed, arrested him and sent him back to London for trial. He was acquitted. Not only acquitted, he was knighted. Sir Henry Morgan was then appointed Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica, where he spent his final years enforcing anti-piracy laws against the very men he had once commanded. History has a very dark sense of humor. Step back from the raids and the famous names and ask a simpler question. What was it actually like to live on Tortuga? At its peak in the 1660s and 1670s, the island had a population of somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 people. Small by any measure, but its influence was disproportionate, because every pirate ship moving through the Western Caribbean eventually passed through its harbor, and every one of those ships left money, goods, and stories behind. The main settlement, called Basse-Terre, ran along the southern shore. There was no town planning. Buildings went up where people decided to put them. Taverns and storehouses and repair yards and homes jammed together without any organizing logic, the streets turning to mud in the rainy season and baking to iron in the dry. There was no cathedral. There was no courthouse. There was no prison, which is philosophically consistent when you think about it. The men who built Tortuga had mostly left places with too many prisons. The taverns were the center of everything. Rum was cheap, cheaper than almost anywhere else in the Caribbean, because so much of it arrived as plunder rather than through legitimate trade. A successful pirate returning from a raid might arrive in Bastere with hundreds of pieces of eight and leave weeks later with almost nothing. This was not considered a failure. It was considered correct behavior. The culture of Tortuga was explicitly anti-accumulation. You went out, you risked everything, you came back. You spent what you earned, and then you went out again. Saving money on Tortuga was regarded with roughly the same suspicion that hoarding was regarded everywhere else, as a kind of antisocial behavior, a refusal to participate in the community. The markets were extraordinary. Stolen goods from across the Spanish Empire were available for purchase at a fraction of their original price. Church silver from raided Venezuelan towns, silk from captured merchant vessels, spices, weapons, navigation instruments, wine from Spain itself, all of it flowing through the harbor at Bastere in a black market so large and so busy that European merchants made specific voyages to Tortuga just to shop there. The island was, in economic terms, a giant discount outlet for the products of Spanish imperial violence. The population was the most diverse in the Caribbean, itself already one of the most diverse regions on Earth. French, English, Dutch, African men who had been freed or escaped from slavery, indigenous men from various Caribbean peoples, Portuguese, even some Spanish who had crossed to the other side. They did not all get along. Violence was constant and casual, but the basic principle held. If you were here, the community extended to you. Your past did not follow you to Tortuga, and what you had been before did not determine what you could become there. Under Bertrand Dodron, who became governor in 1665 and proved to be the most effective administrator in Tortuga's history, the system was formalized and the island reached its absolute peak. Dodron was a French colonial official, but a pragmatic one, which in the 17th century made him nearly unique. He understood that Tortuga's power came not from France but from the pirates. So instead of trying to suppress them, he worked with them. He formalized the revenue-sharing arrangement Levasseur had started. He encouraged settlement. He even, controversially, arranged for women to be brought to the island, wives and companions for men who had been living entirely among other men, understanding that a population with families was a more stable population than one without them. Under Dodron, Tortuga was less a pirate camp and more a pirate city-state. Small, violent, built on theft and rum, but a city-state nonetheless. Let us step back one more time and look at what Tortuga represented, not romantically, but honestly, within the context of its historical moment. The world outside Tortuga in the 1650s and 1660s was a world of absolute hierarchy. In England, France, and Spain, your position at birth determined almost everything about your life. The son of a nobleman was a nobleman. The son of a peasant was a peasant. The church told you what was true. The crown told you what was permitted. If you were a woman, your husband owned you legally. If you were enslaved, the law considered you property. If you were poor, you could be conscripted, imprisoned for debt, flogged in the navy, or worked to death in an indentured servitude that was barely distinguishable from enslavement. These were not edge cases. These were the fundamental structures of European civilization. On Tortuga, the elected captains and the signed articles and the equal distribution of plunder were not accidents. They were deliberate choices made by men who had been at the bottom of the European social order and had decided with considerable clarity that the arrangement was not acceptable. The pirate code was not a romantic fantasy. It was a practical rejection of every institution that had failed these men: the navy, the church, the colonial economy, the crown. The historian Marcus Rediker is not alone in pointing this out. The political philosopher Peter Lamborn Wilson, writing under the name Hakim Bey, called the pirate settlements of the Caribbean temporary autonomous zones, spaces outside the control of any state where alternative social arrangements became possible. The language is more theoretical than the buccaneers themselves would have used, but the observation is accurate. Tortuga was a place where the normal rules did not apply, and in that absence, people built something different. Here is the timeline that should give you chills if you let it. The buccaneers of Tortuga were signing their articles and electing their captains in the 1650s and 1660s. John Locke published his foundational works on government by consent, the philosophical foundation of modern democracy, in 1689. The American Declaration of Independence came in 1776. The French Revolution in 1789. None of those events were caused by pirates. But they were all asking the same question that the men of Tortuga had already answered badly, violently, with enormous human cost, but answered decades earlier. Can people govern themselves? The buccaneers of Tortuga said yes, and they built something to prove it. That something had terrible costs. The same men who voted on their articles were participating in a system of enslaved human beings. The same island that offered freedom to European outcasts was embedded in a Caribbean economy built on the most brutal form of human exploitation ever devised. Tortuga did not transcend the contradictions of its era. It contained them. What it did was demonstrate, in miniature, that the hierarchical order of European civilization was not inevitable, that there were other ways to organize human affairs, and that people at the very bottom of that hierarchy could figure them out on their own, without guidance from kings or priests or anyone else. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, one of the most significant things a place can demonstrate. Every counterculture eventually attracts the culture it countered. Tortuga's golden age ended not in a single dramatic battle, but in the slow suffocation of treaties, economics, and the relentless expansion of the very empires the buccaneers had been defying. The turning point was the Treaty of Madrid, signed in 1670 between England and Spain. England agreed to stop issuing letters of marque to privateers attacking Spanish vessels. Spain agreed to recognize English possession of Jamaica and other Caribbean territories they had taken. Both sides got what they wanted. What they eliminated in the fine print was the entire economic model that Tortuga ran on. The letters of marque had given the buccaneers a crucial legal ambiguity. They were not pirates, they were privateers, operating under government authorization. When that authorization disappeared, the men who had operated under it became outlaws in the eyes of the very powers that had once protected them. The English governors of Jamaica, who had welcomed pirate captains like Henry Morgan as useful weapons against Spain, began enforcing anti-piracy laws with real consequences. Men who had been celebrated were now being hanged. The message from the crowns of Europe was clear. The era of tolerated piracy was finished. Morgan's Panama raid in 1671 was the last major operation of the old system, launched under letters of marque that were already outdated, by a man who knew exactly what he was doing and did it anyway. His subsequent arrest and acquittal and knighthood was less a vindication than a demonstration of how the old pirates were being absorbed into the respectable world rather than destroyed by it. Morgan became the system. The buccaneers who remained on Tortuga did not have that option. The economics also shifted against them. Spain had spent a century extracting the most accessible gold and silver from the Americas. The treasure fleets of the 1680s and 1690s were smaller and better protected than those of the 1640s and 1650s. The easy raids were gone. The risk-reward calculation had changed fundamentally. The same raid that would have made a crew rich in 1660 might not cover its costs in 1685. Some pirates moved north, operating along the coast of North America. Others made the long voyage east and south, around the Cape of Good Hope into the Indian Ocean, where the trading ships of the Mughal Empire offered new opportunities. The Golden Age of Caribbean piracy did not end so much as it migrated. Tortuga itself drifted into formal French colonial control. The buccaneers who remained began moving to the western coast of Hispaniola, which would eventually become the French colony of Saint-Domingue, today's Haiti. The harbor at Basse-Terre was still used, but less and less by pirates, more and more by legitimate traders operating under French authority. By 1700, Tortuga was no longer the center of anything. The island that had once been the most dangerous place on Earth was becoming, simply, an island. The history of Tortuga after its golden age is largely a history of forgetting, but the land it sat beside did not forget anything. The western third of Hispaniola, where the original buccaneers had hunted and the Spanish had tried to eradicate them, became Saint-Domingue, the most profitable colony in the world. By the late 18th century, Saint-Domingue was producing roughly 40% of Europe's sugar and more than half its coffee, all of it grown on the backs of 700,000 enslaved Africans living in conditions that contemporaries described as among the worst on Earth. The violence had not gone away. It had been reorganized, channeled from the random brutality of piracy into the systematic brutality of plantation slavery, more efficient, more profitable, and in many ways more horrifying precisely because it was so structured. The same Caribbean where the buccaneers had built their democratic code for distributing stolen treasure had become the center of one of history's greatest crimes. In 1791, Saint-Domingue became the site of the only successful slave revolution in history. The Haitian Revolution began on the night of August 22nd with a ceremony in the forest of Bois Cayman and did not end for 13 years. It ended with the complete defeat of Napoleon's army, the army that had just conquered most of Europe, and the declaration of the Republic of Haiti on January 1, 1804. The descendants of the enslaved people who had worked the same soil that the buccaneers had hunted fought over 13 years of unimaginable violence and won their freedom. They did it in defiance of every empire in the Atlantic world, against odds that dwarfed anything Pierre Legrand had faced on that dark night with his 28 starving men. The question the buccaneers of Tortuga had answered with their articles and their elected captains, can people govern themselves against the will of established power, was answered again at far greater cost by the people of Haiti, and this time it stuck. Tortuga itself became part of Haiti after independence. Today it is called Isle de la Tortue. It has a population of around 25,000 people. It is one of the poorest parts of one of the poorest countries in the Western Hemisphere. The fort that Levasseur built with his own hands, the fort that held off the Spanish fleet and made Tortuga impenetrable for 40 years, is mostly ruins. The harbor that once sheltered hundreds of pirate ships now shelters fishing boats. The jungle that gave cover and fresh water to the buccaneers still covers the peaks. And the stories are still there too, in the ruins of the fort, in the shape of the harbor, in the turtle-shaped outline of the island that you can still trace from above. The stories Tortuga generated have never gone away. In 1678, Alexander Exquemelin published his account of the buccaneers, written from first-hand experience, by the surgeon who had sailed with them. It was translated into French, Dutch, German, and English within a decade. It was a massive bestseller. It shaped European consciousness about Caribbean piracy so thoroughly that everything that came after it was, in some sense, a response to it. Daniel Defoe's A General History of the Pirates, published in 1724, gave us most of what we think we know about the great pirates of the early 18th century: Blackbeard, Calico Jack, Anne Bonny, Bartholomew Roberts. Whether Defoe actually wrote it is still debated by historians. What is not debated is its influence. It was the text through which the pirate was transformed from a real criminal into a literary archetype. Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, published in 1883, gave the world Long John Silver and the image of the cunning, morally ambiguous pirate that has dominated fiction ever since. And in the Pirates of the Caribbean films, Tortuga appears as the chaotic rum-soaked port that Jack Sparrow calls home. A fantasy, certainly, but not entirely disconnected from the historical reality. What the films miss, what the legend almost always misses, is the structure beneath the chaos. The articles, the elected captains, the quartermaster system, the fact that Tortuga was not random disorder but deliberately constructed alternative order, built by men who had experienced the worst of European civilization and decided with practical intelligence and considerable audacity that they could do better. Jack Sparrow is funny. The actual buccaneers of Tortuga were something more interesting. They were political. The island sits there today, quiet and largely forgotten, holding a story more complicated and more interesting than anything Hollywood has ever put on screen. The turtle-shaped rock that for 50 years was the most dangerous address in the Atlantic world is now a place most people have never heard of, in a country the world too often ignores. But the story it contains does not require fame to matter. A group of people that the world had thrown away, escaped servants, religious refugees, naval deserters, criminal fugitives, men and women of a dozen nationalities with nothing in common except their rejection of the systems that had failed them, looked at an empty island and decided to build something. What they built was violent and exploitative and full of the contradictions of their era. It was also, in the specific way that matters most, free. Its captains were elected. Its contracts were signed by consent. Its harbor was open to anyone. Its shares were divided equally. And it lasted against the combined opposition of the most powerful empires on Earth for 50 years. 50 years is not long, but 50 years is long enough to prove a point. The point the buccaneers of Tortuga proved, that people discarded by every institution can build functional governance from nothing, that authority does not require kings or priests or inherited titles, that a community can run itself by consent, is a point that the world has spent the 4 centuries since then slowly, painfully, imperfectly trying to generalize. We are still trying. The experiment is still running. And it started, more than most people know, on a turtle-shaped rock in the Caribbean, in the smell of charred meat and rum and gunpowder, among men who had nothing left to lose and decided, in the absence of any other option, to build something worth having. Tortuga was never just an island, it was a dare, and the dare is still out there. That is not nothing, that is everything. Thank you for watching. If this hit you the way I hope it did, share it. This is the kind of history that deserves an audience. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next one. Keep your powder dry.